Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriot's History of the United States, reading through our fine book here. And we are at the very tail end at the beginning of chapter 7, Red Foxes and Bear Flags. And we are at the very end. Did I say that? Yeah, that's right. Of a section called Buckskins and Bible Thumpers. And we just have one paragraph to go, and then we're going to go into the header called the Isms. And so, as I've said many times, if you're reading along and you're in the 15th anniversary edition, you're fine. If you're in an earlier edition, the page numbers won't line up, but the header should. And if you're in a really early edition, even some of the headers won't line up. You'll just have to kind of poke around. So I'm on the last paragraph of page 237, wrapping up Buckskins and Bible Thumpers. With such a wide variety of religious experiences in America, toleration was more than ever demanded. And indeed, in America, the result was the degree of interdenominational tolerance probably unknown anywhere else in the world at that time. Schools certainly had to avoid specific denominational positions, so they emphasized elements of Christianity that almost all believers could agree upon, such as the resurrection, love, faith, and hope. That in turn led to revitalization of the Ten Commandments as easily agreed upon spiritual principles. By the way, let me just say this. There's a big push perhaps in the 70s and even 80s, to remove the Ten Commandments from courthouses. And by the way, they're still on the Supreme Court, but on courthouses and on public buildings and so on and so forth, as separation of church and state, right? Now, here's an experiment that was done by an MIT behavioral engineer. I can't remember his name, but I do remember his book. It was called Predictably Irrational. Anyway, he did a whole bunch of experiments, but he did one experiment in which he told the students they were going to have a test, short test. I think it's 50 questions. And he said he would pay them $1 per answer for every answer they got right. So he got a baseline. Let's say students got on average 25 right. Next part of the test, he would tell students, I'm going to pay you for every answer you get right. The test starts in 15 minutes. He then would whisper out of sight to one of the students the answers to the quiz. And he'd go away, come back 15 minutes later, administer the quiz. And what do you think happened? The test scores went up because that student shared the answers with all of his friends. Third part of the test. Again, I'll pay you $1 for every question you get right. Shared the answers with one of the students ahead of time, came back, but this time before going in and giving them the test, he said something. He said, now, I want you to think about your favorite song. All right, go ahead and take the test. No change from the elevated test scores from before when he gave the one student the answers. Last part of the test. Pay you $1 for every answer you get correct. Whispers the answer to one of the students ahead of time. Leaves for 15 minutes. Comes back, says, all right, let's take the test. Oh, this time, before you take the test, I want you to remember as many of the 10 commandments as you can. And what happened to the scores? They fell back down. Not all the way down to the baseline, obviously, because some students probably couldn't remember any 10 commandments. But they fell dramatically. And his conclusion from that study was that merely being put in remembrance of the right thing caused people to do the right thing. So don't tell me it's not important that we remove these moral imperatives from our public spaces. Okay. Well, let's see. That in turn led to a revitalization of the Ten Commandments as easily agreed upon spiritual principles. This doctrinal latitude of toleration, which applied to most Christians with different interpretations of Scripture, did not extend to Catholics, who did not engage in the same level of evangelization as the revivalist sects, yet competed as effectively in more traditional church building and missionary activity among the Indians, where the Jesuits enjoyed much more success than the Protestants. Okay, page 238, and we're starting a section, a header now called the Isms. Perfectionists sought not only to revise the traditional understandings of sin and redemption, but also to reorder worldly, social, economic systems. Let's get this here. Communalism. What happened here? Sorry. There we go. Communalism. Systems of government for virtually autonomous local communities emerged in hundreds of utopian societies that dotted the landscape of American reform. Jacksonian communalism did not in any way resemble modern socialist states with their machines of autocratic centralized economic control. These were truly just sharing potlatches and, where everybody exchanges food and help and so on and so forth. Early American communalism was voluntary and local and represented the most radical antebellum reform ideas. The most successful of the communes were rooted in religious fundamentalism, like Hopedale communalist Aden Ballou. Religious utopians believed man was ruled, quote, by the law of God written on his heart without the aid of external bonds. So another thing to note about these early communalist movements, not only were they not like modern socialist movements, but they believed in God, and the Bible was their touchstone, not some doctrine made up by man. So it's quite different. All right. Communalism in America began with the 1732 immigration of German Lutheran pietists under Conrad Bissell to Ephrata, Pennsylvania. Later in 1805, George Rapp founded Harmony in western Pennsylvania, moving to the Wabash River in Indian Territory in 1815. Englishwoman Anne Lee brought her Shaker sect to upstate New York in 1774, where it grew and spread after her death. Like the radical Lutherans, Shakers experimented with property sharing, vegetarianism, and sexual abstinence. Their church membership thus grew only through conversion and adoption, as you might imagine. They claimed private property was sinful and that sex was, quote, an animal passion of the lower orders. I guess that's why God told Adam and Eve to fill the whole earth. Okay. Shakers also took the radical position that God was both male and female. Frugal and humble, Shakers practiced wildly enthusiastic religious dances, from which the term Shaker is derived, as opposed to the earlier Quaker, and spoke to God in tongues. Perhaps more significant, many of the new religious sects actually, quote, had very ancient origins, but it was only in the free air and the vast spaces of America that they blossomed. The Transcendentalists, a famous group of Massachusetts reformers, left an important legacy in the field of American literature, but their attempts at communalism proved fairly disastrous. Transcendentalists were Congregationalists run wild. Unorthodox Christians, they espoused in varying degrees God in nature, which is deism, and that's prohibited by the Bible, deep meditation, individualism, and nonconformity. perpetual inspiration, ecstasy, and the transcendence of reality to reach communion with God. Among the transcendentalists stand some of America's greatest intellectuals and writers: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, and others. To achieve their high goals, transcendentalists founded two utopias: Bronson Alcott's and Charles Lane's 1843 Fruitlands was a socialistic agrarian colony whose members proved so inept at farming that they endured for less than a year. George Ripley's Brook Farm and other communes likewise either buckled under the sacrifices or substantially modified their programs, leading Nathaniel Hawthorne to parody them in The Blithedale Romance, a book in 1852. Failure of one group seemed to have no impact on the appearance of others, at least in the short run. John Humphrey Noyes, an eccentric among eccentric reformers, founded one of the most American communes at Oneida, New York. Originally a millenarian, Noyes coined the term perfectionist in advocating what he called Bible communism, which forbade private property and instigated polygamous marriages. All the members, Noyes declared, recognized the right of religious inspiration to shape identity and dictate the form of family life. Just a note here, and this is, you can just take this or leave it, but God in no place in the Bible prohibits private property. Quite the contrary to all of the Old Testament patriarchs, Abraham, all the others. A sign of God's blessing was, in fact, private property, was lots of cattle, lots of sheep, and forms of earthly wealth. And it's interesting, a close reading of even the rich young ruler shows that Jesus told him, sell what you have and give to the poor. There's a word missing. He didn't say give it all to the poor. He said, sell what you have, give to the poor, and follow me. Take that for what it's worth. But it is absolutely true that the early church in Jerusalem had all things in common. They shared all things. But it's also important to understand that they did that totally voluntarily and under no ordinance or compunction from Peter or Paul or any of the other apostles. They just did it. And when Sapphira and Ananias come in and they give over their money that they had raised from selling the land, they died because they didn't hand it all over. The message wasn't that they didn't hand over all their money. The message was they said they were handing over all their money, and they didn't. They flat out lied. So anyway, I just, and of course, throughout the New Testament, we see that wealthy people, including Drusilla, for example, support the ministry. Without money, ain't going to be no ministry. My wife likes to say romance without finance is nonsense. And what I think the same is true with religion. I mean, buildings cost money. Utilities cost money. If you're going to have a church building, and I understand the early church met in people's homes, but if you get too big for that, you got to meet somewhere. Anyway, that's just a thought, but I think these people get misread scripture here. Noyes demonstrated the great danger of all utopian thinkers whose search for freedom led them ultimately to reject any social arrangements, traditions, church doctrine, or even familial relationships or expressions of power. Marriage, they held, constituted just another form of oppression, even slavery, a point upon which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would completely agree. Their oft-quoted ideals of liberty masked their darker reputation of the very order envisioned by the founders, not to mention most Christian thinkers. Very clearly in the Bible, whether you like it or not, there's a pretty set order of things, from God to man to the animals, and within the family, from the husband to the wife to the children. I mean, this is all pretty well ordered. And once you start doing away and this is not a defense of slavery, by the way, but once you start doing away with these orders, these hierarchies, and that every hierarchy is bad and every relationship is bad, and that's going to lead you right to Marx, who says every single relationship in and of itself is a act of power. Lenin, the only question is who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. To a Marxist, that's the only question. That's why you see all these people on campuses going so crazy about which group is the true victim group and which group is the oppressor group. And currently, and I'm speaking here in December 2023, the favored oppressed group are the Palestinians, and the favored oppressor group are the Israelis, where there was a time when Jews were the oppressed group, okay, but now they've been replaced on the victim ladder, as I call it. Got a nice ladder of victimhood. So you see all of that right here in these early isms. Still other utopians abandoned social activism and turned toward philosophy, most notably Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 82, and his fellow transcendentalists. Fittingly, Emerson described himself as a transparent eyeball. Emerson was, let's be honest, he was a nut job. He had some interesting things to say, but he also was just crazy and was a closet anti-Semite. He went to great lengths to, whenever he wrote Bible verses, he would deliberately change them in ways that were not favorable to God or the Bible verse. It's never favorable to do that, but he would also make it say things it was never meant to say. So you might look at that if you ever read through Emerson. One of my mentors, Robert Lowenberg, wrote a book on Emerson. What was it called? Emerson and the American Idol, or something like that. Anyway, he was a closet anti-Semite. Scottish and French socialists Robert Dale Owen and Charles Fournier, Owen's my favorite, attracted American converts, but their experiments also failed miserably. Owen sought to eradicate individualism through education in New Harmony, Indiana, which he bought from the Rappites. No, the Rappites are not related to the rappers. The Rappites in 1825. Yet despite Owen's doctrinal desires, individualism went untamed among the 800 unruly Owenites whose children ran amok, and this is what happens when it takes a village to raise a child. A village cannot raise a child. A village will not raise a child. It takes parents. And if a village tries to raise a child, ends up nobody raises a child. Children ran amok and who eagerly performed head work, that is thinking, but disdained handwork, physical labor of any sort. Predictably, New Harmony soon ran out of food. Promising to destroy the, quote, three-headed hydra, God, marriage, property, Owen himself was nearly destroyed. He poured good money after bad into the colony, losing a fortune calculated in modern terms to have been in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Likewise, 28 separate attempts to establish Foyer's phalanxes, Foyer's utopian organizational scheme from Massachusetts to Iowa in 1841 to 1858 also failed. Members were expected to live on 80 cents a week, a sum below even what contemporary Benedictine Franciscan monks survived on. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Owen. Robert Owen was the son of a wealthy industrialist in Scotland, and he had this perfectionist idea early, and so he started a colony called New Lanark in Scotland, and basically a communal type, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, which never works because those who have the ability don't want to work too much for those just so they have no needs, right? And those who have needs always find a way to have greater and greater and greater needs. It's just human nature. So that colony failed. Well, what did Owen take out of that? He took out of that, oh, this is just the wrong place. This is what constantly happens with communism and socialism. They will never admit the idea is bad. they will constantly say, well, it just hasn't been tried yet. And they would say this, especially during the Soviet Union years, when people would look at the Soviet Union, which, they weren't starving, but they did not have plenty, put it that way. And consumers had very, very little. They drove cruddy little cars and lived in these very, brick prison looking apartment complexes and had virtually no choice in clothing and so forth. Went crazy, would spend all their money on a Beatles album if they could get one. And the Soviets would always, the pro-Soviet people here who would make excuses, the apologists for communism, would always say, well, communism just hasn't been tried in the right place. Well, they tried it in Cuba and the same thing happened there. They tried it in North Korea, the same thing happened there. They tried it in China, same thing happened there, until in the last 20 or so years, Xi and some of his pals began to try to move toward capitalism, was what Gorbachev tried to do just before the Soviet Union fell apart. And history has taught us that when you do that, in fact, the regime ends up having to tighten down and control more and more, because as people flex their freedom muscles, pretty soon they're going to be criticizing the government. So it's interesting to watch China today and see what's going to happen with China. Obviously, bigger nation than anywhere else that's ever tried it. Much different nation in terms of family structure and order within that society. But in terms of producing abundance, communism has failed everywhere it's been tried. It's looking better in China only as they get less communist. How less communist can they get before the whole system breaks down like it did in Russia? And from my discussions of the 4 pillars, they don't have the 4 pillars. So like Russia, if communism totally breaks down there, there's a pretty good chance that you'll end up with chaos and then a bunch of oligarchs running things, a feudal system very much like it was back in the 1500s or something. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong, but so far I've been right every time about these communist societies. So Owen says, I just got the wrong place. I need to go to America. And so he brings all these people over, none of whom have a lick of common sense or skills in building buildings and planting farms and making leather goods, anything that would be useful to help you stay alive. I've just been reading a really interesting novel called Catalyst, about an EMP blast that goes off in America, and we are instantly sent back to the early 1800s without any electricity. And you just can't imagine how much our daily lives in every aspect, from the water we drink, obviously, to the power we have that heats and cools our homes, to our transportation. The only cars that would run were like pre-1960 cars that had distributors and didn't have electronic ignition, to pumping the gas. How do you get the gas out? It all uses electricity. So you find very quickly that even in this novel, at least, even the survivalists didn't last very long. They lasted a while, but once their stockpiles ran out, the real survivors were those who, kind of like in Walking Dead, had the life skills. How do you make a fire without matches or without any electronic help? How do you gather and hunt for food? How do you protect yourself? And one interesting story that develops out of this Catalyst series is the most important asset you can have is your ability to network with other people and have them take care of you in areas where you can't take care of yourself, and to be valuable to the community in other ways, which is the essence of capitalism. Have you served your fellow man today? All right, so back to Robert Owen. So he comes up with all these people who can't really do a thing. And of course, most of them choose to do head work. Well, I'm working really hard today, man. I'm thinking so hard, and nobody wants to go out into the fields. And of course, they're starving. And this is another characteristic of communism and socialism, which is it consumes far more than it produces. It is a net wealth drain on the world. Communism and socialism net drains resources. It doesn't resupply them in the form of new ideas, new energy, new products. It sucks stuff. It's a wealth suck, as I used to tell my students. And so Owen starts pouring money into this community. And like I said in the book, he ends up putting in hundreds of millions of dollars, and it fails anyway, as do all of these. Not one of these places makes money. They may break even. They may get to the point where people can barely survive, but they don't get to where they have enough left over, enough abundance to grow, to do art, to do music, to do great architecture. Not associated with communism. All right, that's a good place for us to stop. We'll pick up there on Friday.